17. Matthew chapter 17. Do you have any friends? Any of you have friends? You chuckle. What? Look at what's going on and find out who your friends really are. Okay. Jesus had some followers, some disciples that went along with them, but really they were more than just students learning how he lived. They were like friends to him also. And there were 3 of them who were closer than all the other 12. Would you stand with me? I'm going to read Matthew 17, the first few verses, about 13 verses worth out of that. Matthew 17. After 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. There he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became white as the light. Just then there appeared before them Moses and Elijah talking with Jesus. Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, we will put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." While he was still speaking, a bright cloud enveloped them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my Son, whom I love, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell face down on the ground, terrified. But Jesus came and touched them. "Get up," he said. "Don't be afraid." When they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus instructed them, "Don't tell anyone what you have seen until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." The disciples asked him, "Why then do the teachers of the law say that Elijah must come first before the coming of Messiah?" Verse 13, 11. Jesus replied, "To be sure, Elijah comes and will restore all things. But I tell you, Elijah has already come, and they did not recognize him, but have done to him everything they wished. In the same way, the Son of Man is going to suffer at their hands." Then the disciples understood that he was talking to them about John the Baptist. You can be seated. So Jesus took 3 friends with him up a high mountain. You ever do mountain climbing? Probably not as high as Everest, I would guess. Not in Judea. It wouldn't be that high. They took a long trek up there. You know, Jesus, a lot of times, would go away from the crowd and spend time praying and talking with God. And it wasn't strange for Jesus to take friends with him when he did that. Sometimes it was alone, sometimes he would take them, and sometimes he'd leave them at one spot and go on a ways. He took his 3 closest disciples. It's interesting how this is phrased. He took Peter, a loud mouth, and James, and then it's like he took James's brother. Almost like, well, this guy, he just went along because he was James' little brother. Except that we know that that was John, and John wrote one of the Gospels, and John lived the longest of all of the disciples. I wonder if he was the youngest or just lived the longest. We don't really know for sure. And I think it's important, too, to notice that for Jesus, having friends, not just followers, having friends was important to him. And you look at the list of the 12 apostles he had, they were all kinds of different occupations when they began following him. From Jewish terrorists to tax collector for the Romans to fishermen to all kinds of things. We followed Jesus. Terrorists? Who was how do we know Jesus had a terrorist that followed him? Simon the Zealot. The Zealots was a terror, they were a nationalist Zionist movement. And they would do terroristic acts against the Romans. So, yeah, he had a terrorist among them. So Jesus went up the mountain. Who else do you know that went up a mountain to meet with God? Moses did. There was one
took Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu up on a mountain and talks to God for a while. And this is kind of like, oh, Jesus did this. He took 3 up on the mountain. Just like Moses went up on a mountain to talk to God. He took Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, Aaron's 2 sons, and actually he took some of the elders of Israel up when he went. There are a lot of things that people who knew the history of Israel would look and say, oh boy, those times before, they were so great. Anybody ever go hear someone in this country talk about so-and-so when they were president, or this certain time in history, and this must have been so great? The Jews tended to do that too, looking back in history, and so they were comparing Jesus to Moses, and this is one of the things that they saw that was similar. Do you remember what happened to Moses when he was up on the mountain and talks to God? What happens, how he changed it? Yeah, his face glowed to the place where he'd come down from talking to God and people were like, ooh, this is freaky. And he'd put a veil, he'd cover his face over so it wouldn't scare the people. It wasn't just Jesus' face when he was on the mountain that changed what it looked like. All of Jesus' clothing began to shine as bright as the light when Jesus was up on the mountain and went there to talk with God. It doesn't happen all the time. But sometimes when you spend time with God, something really cool happens. And you go, wow. See, we may not change even on the how we look. We don't glow physically. But you've seen some people's faces after they've been talking to God. You can see the smile. You can see the joy on their face. You can almost see the peace in them. When you spend time with God, things in you change. And that's more important than what the outside looks like anyway. We still have our humanness on the outside, but what changes inside when you spend that time with God is important. Jesus took his friends to experience God with him. He often went away to pray, and he often took his disciples with him. Now, some of you know there was a phase, there was a time in the church when people would say, oh, well, you don't want to pray out loud. The devil might hear you. You ever hear somebody say that? Don't pray out loud, the devil might hear you, then he's going to do stuff to stop your prayer. Where in the Bible does it say that? Nowhere. I've talked to some people too who's, for me, I'm not sure. But my experience has been sometimes it seems like when I pray out loud, not pray in front of people out loud necessarily, but when I pray out loud, somehow it seems like those prayers get answered more. And I've mentioned that to some people and it's like, yeah, that's kind of happened to me. How many of you have heard someone else, like mom, dad, grandma, grandpa, pray for you? Some of you have, that's had a big impact on your life. Jesus went off and he would pray, but he would take his friends with him when he prayed. Some of the times, lots of the times. And they would hear him pray. How do you learn to pray anyway? You just wake up one morning and you know how to pray. Did you ever hear anybody pray? Just all of a sudden you know. No, that doesn't work that way. We pray, we hear someone else pray, and we learn how to pray. We learn that I can just talk to God, just like I'm talking to whoever. Jesus took his friends along. I remember when I was preschool age and when I was in kindergarten, there was a family who babysat me. I remember at lunchtime after half-day kindergarten, the family getting together around the table and praying. I remember feeling God there. I remember when I was a little kid in church and we didn't have nice carpet on the floors and we didn't have pads on the seats. And I was a little kid and I didn't always sit still, but I remember on that tile floor, sometimes sliding back and forth under the pews. You could lay in your back. One seat, two seats, three. Oops, mom's looking for me. But I could remember times when the church was praying and the people were up front. And I could feel there was something different that was happening. And I knew God was there. To give those experiences to his friends, Jesus took his friends along when he was praying. And there were times when God showed up like they did here. And his friends would go, wow, we'd just like to stay here forever if we could. You know that most young people in our country, according to surveys that have been done, don't know what the presence of God feels like. Even a lot of people in church, in different places, don't know what it feels like. They haven't had experiences with God. Oh, don't bring your little kids to church or put them off someplace else because they're going to be restless and it's going to be hard to pay attention. And you know, they might even feel God there if they go. Oh, yeah, that would be a good thing, wouldn't it? I mean, so this little boy was scooting back and forth under the pews during prayer time, trying to be quiet so I wouldn't get in trouble. But I could tell that God was there. It's not a crime and it's not a bad thing to pray and have someone else hear you. Jesus said, don't pray trying to get people to hear you because I want them to know how pretty I pray. No, Jesus said if what you're doing is trying to impress people, that's all you get. But there's nothing wrong otherwise with someone hearing us when we pray and being there when God shows up and knowing that God's around. That's awesome. John wrote, James's brother, who went up there on a mountain, he wrote his first letter that he wrote, called 1 John, that which we have seen and heard, we're proclaiming to you. John was on a mountain. What he saw, what he heard, what he knew about Jesus, what happened, including what was on the mountain. We've told you about it. We have seen his glory, John writes in 1 John. Yeah, he sure had. On that mountain when Jesus just began to shine, he saw him. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son of God. John also writes, God is light, and in him there is no darkness. It said a cloud wrapped around them. What kind of cloud was it? A bright cloud. In God there's no darkness, there's no evil, there's no wrong. Jesus ranks right up there with Moses and Elijah, if you're trying to make comparisons. Moses, let's see. God buried him, Elijah. He was taken up to heaven in a whirlwind and a chariot of fire. And people were looking for both of them to come back before this great leader, Messiah, who would lead the world to peace, showed up. Which we know is a peace inside, because the world is still at war. And they did come back on that mountain. In fact, Jesus said, Elijah came back. Someone came in the spirit of Elijah, named John the Baptist, and priest, and prepared the way for Jesus. And they were talking about, Luke says when he tells the same story, talking about Jesus' departure, what would happen when he was crucified and died. Jesus was not consulting the dead, by the way, when Moses and Elijah showed back up. The Bible tells us we're not supposed to try to get in contact with the dead and consult them. Tell us, what do you know? And most of the time when those things happen, it's a demon who knew that person that comes and tells you things, and the demon who knew that person could impersonate them very well. Just so you know that, it's not the actual person that shows up. Peter said, the guy that always speaks first and then thinks, or often. And let's build shelters. Let's build booths. Let's build a place where we can stay for a while. Oh, that's another connection, by the way, between Moses and Jesus, because in the times Moses led them around in the wilderness, getting ready to go into the land God promised them, they lived in tents and different kinds of shelters, and the Jews had a holiday every year where they were supposed to build a shelter out on the top of their house, flat roofs, or someplace, and live in those for a little while to remember when they didn't have homes to live in during the days of Moses. Some things that are just similar between Moses and Jesus, except Jesus is better. While they were there, and Peter's saying, let's just stay here, let's build places to stay, something happened. This bright cloud surrounds them, and what happens? What? A voice. There was a voice from heaven, and God said, listen up. Kind of. He said three things. This is my son. This is my son. I really love him. To be the son of God in Jewish culture had two possible meanings. One of them they didn't really want to think about. The main meaning it had was, whenever there was a king, they would call their king like a son of God, someone that God had chosen to lead his people. Other nations around them would say that too. This is like God's son. Not really thinking it was God's son like that, but this is someone who represents God to us. He's leading us in God's name. But we find out with Jesus is more than that. And Jesus gives hints all the way through his life and his ministry that there's more to it than that, because it was okay to call God our Father, but Jesus called God my Father. You're not supposed to say he's only your Father. Jesus was the Son of God in a way no one else is. And Jesus existed with God the Father before anything was made, and everything that exists was made through him. So yeah, he's Son of God in a totally different way than most Jews would have thought about. This is my Son, whom I love. I'm well pleased with him. I agree with what he's doing. He's doing what I sent him to do. Everything he does is right. I'm pleased. And then he said, listen to him. By the way, the Jewish word for listen, the Hebrew word for listen, which is not going to be in our New Testament, which was written in Greek. But they would be thinking in Jewish minds because that's where their whole culture came from. That word, listen, shema, means to hear and obey. To hear it and to do it. So when God spoke and he said, listen to him, he didn't mean, yeah, these are nice words, they'll sound really cool on your ears. No. These are good thoughts, nice stuff to think about. No. He meant, listen to what he has to say and do what he has to say. We have a lot of people running around in our country today. If I believe in God, I don't act like it, but I believe in him. That's not what he means. Listening and doing. I believe in God so much that I'm going to practice what God says to do. And we're not just servants of God. Jesus has made us friends because Jesus said, in fact John wrote down what Jesus said. He's told us what the Father's business is so we can be about our Father's business. Just like I was talking earlier, missions moments that Marcia picked out is letting other people know about Jesus. Spreading that good news. There are some experiences we call mountaintop experiences. You know why? That goes back to the Bible. That's where that phrase, that expression comes from. An experience that just knocks the socks off of it. It's just wonderful. It's, wow, this is so cool. One thing about a mountaintop experience is it doesn't last. You have those times and it's really great to have these thrilling things happen, but most of life is not just thrilling, right? So you have to come down from there at some point. We have those good times with God. You know, you won't have a really good, really close time with God every time you go to pray. But if you want to have some great times with God, the more you pray, the more you talk to God, the more time you spend with God, the more chances are you'll have those some awesome times with God. But it's not the experience that we're looking for. Some people say, well, you know, everybody ought to try to talk in tongues. Everybody ought to try to do miracles. Everybody ought to try to have a word of wisdom and a word of knowledge come to them. And it's not those experiences we're looking for. It's God that we want. I want to be close to God. God can do what he wants to. I'm not going to tell God, hey, you have to do this for me so I'll be happy. So it's not the experience I'm looking for, it's God I want. I want God in my life. Then let God do what's good for me. Because God, I found out, knows a whole lot more about what's good for me than what I know. So we're not seeking the experience, we're seeking God. We need to spend time with God to know God. He only took 3 friends. Only 3 of them went the distance and went to the top of the mountain with him. How far are you willing to travel with God to have a good experience with him? Maxine and others have said you don't rush into the presence of God. They walked a long ways to get up to the top of that mountain. And they had to stay there a while until God appeared and talked with Jesus and spoke to them from the cloud. You willing to stay and wait for a while before God? If this famous band were coming through town and they were just riding by on the road and they were going to stop at Sanbury's Corner for a little bit, how long would you wait till they showed up so you could just see them briefly? How long will you wait for God? For Him to show up. When God showed up, when He spoke, they fell on their faces. You know, it's a humbling thing. Sometimes a little frightening, but not like terrifying. When God shows up and you have an experience with Him. On the way down the mountain, they had some questions. Sometimes we have questions, don't we? I hope you're taking friends with you when you spend time with God. And your friends might also have some questions. It may be your kids. It may be your grandkids. Like my babysitter's household, that they included me in the time that they prayed. And I'm not going to tell you every single time that they prayed, I really felt something different. There were times that I really knew God was there. Are you taking people with you? Are you helping them to understand, explaining to them what you know about God? Like Jesus was explaining things on the way down the mountain. And then there was almost a P.S. Because Jesus said, Elijah came, they did with him what they wanted to, he suffered, and the Son of Man, referring to himself, is also going to suffer. And there's no guarantee that following God means you're never going to have anything that makes you suffer. In fact, sometimes we'll suffer things because we're doing what's right, and people really don't want one of these people around that's going to do what's right. Sometimes that happens, right? And we don't know the direction our country and the world is going if we may not have persecution in our country at some point, not too far down the road. Jesus adds, there's suffering, okay. Suffering may be part of following. It was for John the Baptist and it was for Jesus. Let me wrap this up. Here's further proof that Jesus was special and approved by God, this experience that happened on the top of the mountain. He was the Son of God and away no other one. That's better. God's voice spoke. Also, we need to take time off with God. Sometimes it'll be awesome. Sometimes it'll just be regular time with God. Depends on what God chooses to do. Take other people with you when you go into God's presence. Let them be along when you're praying sometimes. Kids, grandkids, neighbors, other people from church. And then people who don't know or have questions, just like Jesus, but be willing to help explain. And sometimes someone asks me, I say, I really don't know. Because sometimes we don't understand what God's doing. But I hope you spend those times talking to God. There's a little song that goes, whisper a prayer in the morning, whisper a prayer at noon, whisper a prayer in the evening to keep your heart in tune. I don't know about you, but sometimes I find it's more than a little prayer I have to whisper. Sometimes I have to spend a lot more time to keep my life in tune with God. We're not going to have a song as we close this morning, but I want to have just a moment of quiet and then a prayer, and then I'll dismiss you. If you've not given your life to God, you want to know more about what it is to follow God, ask me after church. Say, hey, can we talk some more about that? If you want to come and pray at the altar while we're having prayer time, that's always fine. In fact, I don't care if you come up in the middle while I'm preaching, because you just want to talk with God. That's fine. Because there's something about spending time with God that the more you do that, then you end up with some times that are exceptionally awesome. Let's pray. Thank you, God, for wanting to spend time with me, with us. For hearing us when we were thanking you and talking to you earlier as a whole group. Thank you, God, that you love us so much. That you have ways of just making me feel so special sometimes. And you do that to everybody who will listen. Thank you for personally making each one of us and making us for a purpose. Thank you for the time we can spend with you, God. In Jesus' name. Amen. Peter said, hey, can we just build a shelter and stay here? If you want to just stay around the altar for a while, that's totally fine with me. Whether you're already up here or not.